Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And again, for those of you who weren't here earlier, I would encourage you to join us closer and feel free to be part of the round tables here. My name's Alan Young. I run a small consultancy called the Materials Efficiency Research Group, but I had the honor of being part of the cadre of folks who bootstrapped the Circular Economy Leadership Coalition, as it was called, back in the late teens with the help of our colleagues at Citra and the Natural Step, Smart Prosperity, and others. So those were much smaller rooms back then, so I have to say it's a real delight to see 1,000 people all talking enthusiastically about circularity. As before, when we came and began our work on circularity, Quebec was a decade ahead of us at the time, and people like Danielle Normandine and others were our kind of mentors in what was possible. As we've built on the shoulders of that great work, and I think it's very appropriate that it's come full circle back here. And there's so much work that has been demonstrated and done since that time. So I'll say congratulations to the organizers and to everyone involved. And it's thrilling to see, especially in these dark times, to see so much positive, creative energy being applied to the future. I'll start by saying that when we did start planning this, it was before Christmas, and oddly enough, the world, it feels funny to say, but the world felt like a very different place back then. And issues of security of supply, on multilateralism, on trade, and regional cooperation were things that were taken for granted at a different level, perhaps falsely so. But since that time, of course, we're dealing with very uncertain times and some closing doors, or at least doors that appear to be open. But we also are seeing some emerging new partnerships, and part of what we'd like to reflect on in this session is that emerging opportunity out of time of crisis and imperative. And so I should start by saying that I wasn't exactly happy with the title, should have revisited that one. It should say optimizing critical minerals supply, not maximizing, because as was reflected in earlier discussions today, we can't keep on consuming at the rates we're consuming. And we need to reduce overall materials flow. We understand that as part of a fundamental part of the circularity and sustainability aspects. So even if we did have the most immaculate EV batteries for all of our big SUVs, that would not be a path to sustainability. So obviously, in the context of this, is not just getting more of this stuff out of the ground faster, as some of our politicians will say, but how do we optimize our use through primary and secondary sources by rethinking transportation, by rethinking product reuse and servicing, by thinking about regeneration. So I think that we want to look at the sort of integrated solutions that circular economy brings to the table to really think hard about what problem we're solving for here. And that's what I hope we'll get out of this. That said, this panel will focus on the inconvenient truth that the renewable energy futures is a materials-intensive future. There's just no getting around that. Renewable energy, whether it's the generation, the transmission, or the storage, is much more materials intensive for a whole variety of reasons, and therefore is going to require a significant amount of what we're calling critical minerals. I'm assuming most of you in this room are here because you know what critical minerals are, but in case you don't, just as a refresher, it's a construct that relates the importance to economy to the insecurity of supply. It's actually a term that was used in the Second World War, mostly around armaments and others, but it applies now. Turns out, the lithiums, the cobalts, the rare earths, a lot of these things that we know about, often through battery technology or through EV technology, are the things we're all familiar with. But country to country, that critical minerals list will change. There's a big overlap on many of these things that are commonly used technologies. And so in Canada, we have 21 of these critical minerals that are broadly recognized that are being produced domestically, not to mention what are in our secondary waste streams and others. So we have a big opportunity and a big responsibility in how we optimize the use of these materials. It's worth noting that while most of us here are focused on how do we generate the green energy of the future so that our agricultural systems, our educational systems, our medical systems, our transportation systems are all run on fossil fuel-free energy systems, we are in competition with the arms industry, with the medical products, with agriculture, and with other parts of the economy, electronics, of course, that are also in high demand for a number of these elements that go into magnets and batteries and other things. So we don't have a clear run at this, and there's a lot of demand out there. So the articulation of a green energy future as a subset of critical minerals is something we always need to keep in mind. And we're seeing here in Canada, the American defense system is actively investing in Canadian mines to ensure it's got the rare earths it wants. So it's a complex environment. So what we hope to do is unpack some of that complexity here with some that will hopefully generate some sense of strategic priorities. So hopefully there's some commonalities across this. There's also some concrete next steps, some ways in which we might focus our investments in the future to disentangle the rhetoric around critical minerals and urgency into something that's a good business case that benefits local communities. So we want to look at full supply chain questions as much as we can, from the mine phase through to the consumer-facing products. We're going to talk a little bit about the hard numbers on demand and supply. Even for me, who's been dealing with this full-time for a long time, those numbers I find deeply sobering. So I hope you take away that sense. We are not going to recycle our way out of this, although we'd have to do a lot more of the secondary use. So that's sobering in and of itself. We're going to look at how the industry is understanding circularity not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And how is the extractive sector, how can they be active players in this? They're not just a supplier of a raw material. There's large industrial strategies or systems that have upstream responsibilities and influences as well as downstream responsibilities and influences. So that's a really big part of the play. But we also want to go well beyond that. There are massive opportunities around secondary sourcing that we are not yet really tapping into. So we're going to look at local strategies, regional strategies. What are some of the benefits? What are some of the infrastructure that's needed? What are some of the capacities that might be required so that we can maximize the value extracted on each element that we pull out of the ground? I mean, to say the obvious, minerals are probably one of the ultimate circular materials. They can be reused ad infinitum, unlike paper, unlike wood, unlike plastics. There's nothing, and the future, assuming that they're designed and used correctly, the future means less energy inputs, less water inputs, less biodiversity inputs. So it's a strong imperative to keep these things in circulation at highest value for a long time. They're the ultimate circularity model, even though a lot of folks would rather not think about the ugly business of mining, with all due respect to our friends in the mining industry, but it can be a messy business, and a lot of people move away from that. But we want to look at waste reduction, value capture, regenerative strategies. How can these be used in the context of metals? And we want to hear from businesses about how they, caught between markets and regulations, are trying to find the right investments and the right focus for their use of minerals, whether it's in lithium-ion batteries or other things, and how do these create operational challenges we might help them meet in a more constructive way. And I think I'll stop there. I want to get right into the next panel, or in the first panel. We're going to do essentially two sessions. One will be a context-setting panel. So we'll be hearing from three of our folks who are well steeped in this from very different angles, and then we'll be joined then after by three additional folks who will be part of a dialogue on opportunities and challenges. And I'm hoping you'll take good notes, ask good questions, and help us fill in the gaps on those priorities and those challenges that you see, whether they're in policy, whether they're in market, whether they're in technology, or however you see the gap there. We need to fill these gaps, and we need to carry it forward understanding and appreciating the complexity of the moment. So without further ado, I think I will ask my longtime colleague and friend, Geoff McCarney, to come up. Geoff's the executive director of the Smart Prosperity Institute, and it's his work on materials demand and flow that I found, even as a somewhat seasoned circularity and mining expert, a bit sobering. So give us the ugly truth.
Thanks, Alan. The bearer of the ugly truth. I always wanted to be introduced at a panel like this. It's nice to be here with everybody today. So as Alan mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Smart Prosperity Institute. If you aren't familiar with us, we are a national research network and think tank based at the University of Ottawa. We work on broad-based environment economy solutions to try to advance smart policy and economic solutions for Canada. And we are focused primarily on Canadian policy examples. So a lot of what I'm going to show you today is Canadian-based, but it is broadly applicable beyond that. I'm not sure if the slides are ready to go.
You might just have to try the...
Oh,
yeah, there we go.
Do I just need to go forward? Okay.
That's ICMM, actually.
So I'm just going to skip through.
It should be the Smart Prosperity.
No, that's not me either. That's not me.
Going in the wrong direction.
Did it get in anywhere? Nope. Okay. We don't have them? Oh, that looks right. Perfect. Except I don't control them, so you'll advance when I say go? Perfect. So if you can go to the first slide. So I've been asked by Alan to walk you through some of our work today, setting some context and some baseline. We do a lot of work on what critical mineral demand looks like to transition to a low-carbon economy in Canada, and then we also think about waste volume, secondary supply potential, circular economy potential that comes out of that. And to sort of, as a spoiler alert, effectively what I'm going to show you today are a lot of increasing curves. Increasing demand curves and increasing waste volume curves. And the real core of it is going to be the difference in the timing of how those evolve, and that really gets to the rub of some of the challenges we have to think about from a circular economy context and from a decarbonization policy context. And to sort of set a baseline for what that looks like in our work, there's sort of two main stories I like to set the stage with in terms of how to think about global material demand for critical minerals. The first is this projection here, which is something we've pulled together from projections from both the United Nations Environment Program and the OECD, sort of projecting global material demand looking forward. And what they show is basically about a tripling to 2050 of non-metallic mineral demand and about a doubling of metal demand to about 2050, even under scenarios assuming really aggressive rates of efficiency improvements. And if you flip to the next slide, the important thing to understand that's not in this projection is the material needs to decarbonize. So what we just saw from the UNEP and the OECD includes things like rapid population growth, increasing numbers of middle-class consumers globally, increasing demand for electronics. You can factor in things that they probably didn't have as much in those curves because those are a little bit dated now. Increasing use arms supply, things like AI demand for these critical minerals to grow AI infrastructure. On top of that, you have to layer material needs for rapid decarbonization. And what we're showing here are projections from groups like the World Bank that show different metals and what's going to be required to meet 2-degree scenarios or beyond 2-degree scenarios in gray or in light green. You'll see there's significant increases for things like battery metals, which we don't currently produce a lot of, but we're going to need a lot of for things like EV batteries. Then there's things ranging from about 50% to 200% increase in demands for other battery minerals, as well as minerals used for solar panels, wind turbines, standalone storage. But I'll point you even to some of the lower ends of the curves, like aluminum and copper, small percentage increases. We produce a lot of those already, though. Those are large aggregate increases, even if we're only talking about our 910% increase in demand. And this layers on top of what I showed you in the previous slide. You have to think of them in aggregate, right? We're increasing demand for critical minerals for decarbonization solutions, as well as broader demand drivers globally from market growth, from population change, from change in technologies, things like that. Next slide, please. So we look at this from a few dimensions. We try to think about what the demand requirements for decarbonization are going to be in Canada to meet certain projections like 2050 net zero electricity supply or 2035 targets currently for EV, switching over to EV from internal combustion engines. And if we think about it in terms of renewable energy as a starting point, this is a report we generated a few years ago for Environment Canada, looking at what both material demand and then corresponding waste increases would be for a transition to solar and wind energy in Canada. And we find things like a 60-fold increase in cumulative end-of-life solar wind panels by 2050, and a 30-fold increase in accumulated wind turbines by 2050. And the important thing is these are conservative scenarios. These scenarios we're running don't even get us close to net zero. They're sort of current policy scenarios we ran at the time. We're currently running scenarios to get to net zero, and that increases those volumes significantly further, even more than that. And to show you what that looks like, if you go to the next slide, this is sort of what those projections look like. The solid line you see at the top is sort of increasing cumulative installed capacity using Canadian Energy Regulator projections of solar capacity to get to net zero by 2050. And then the bars underneath that are accumulating waste volumes as those solar panels either reach failure points early in their lifespan or reach their end of lifespan, which is typically 20, 25 years. And we do some models where we have larger early failures and some models where they're late failures, which is the two different colored bars. But generally the message is you see that installed capacity goes up faster than waste volumes, right? You got to install things before they reach the end of their life and fail. And so you're going to have a difference in those demand versus waste volumes driven by that dynamic. And it seems obvious, but it starts to matter as you work through these scenarios. And the other thing I'll just point out is I have 10,000 tons a year highlighted in the middle. If you're thinking about circular recycling, recovery economies, that's important because when we talk to industry, that's the threshold that they highlight for us that they need to get to economies of scale in sort of standalone recycling of solar panels. And we don't hit that in our projections in Canada at a national scale until 2035. So if we're going to drive economies of scale in solar producing, we're not generating the volumes at a national scale to get that until a little ways into the future. And so we have to think about how we get to having the capacity to handle these volumes without those economies of scale being present now. You skip to the next slide, please. So things that we can think about is, all right, well, with the volumes that we're going to generate over time, given the difference between where we're installing, lifespan in place, when we get waste volumes, how much of the primary demand that we're projecting can we offset with increasing secondary volumes within the sector? And that's what I'm showing you on the left-hand side here. The blue bars show how much of that primary demand we can offset within sector recovery, reuse, recycling for solar panels under current estimates of material recovery rates. And you'll see it's not very much. Most volumes we're not recovering and recycling much at all right now. We get up to 10 to 20% for things like steel, copper, silicon. If we assume 100% instead of all materials are recovered and reused at the end of their life, starting immediately, so unrealistic but sort of bounding the system, we get to the green bars at the back. And we sort of get to a maximum of about 30% of volume we can offset. Right, so that's what you can do within the system. If you want to displace more primary demand, you have to source secondary material from outside of this sector, which means you're competing with other growing sectors. That's the point of the first slides, right? You're competing with electronics. You're competing with other building sectors. You're competing with military to source those secondary materials that are coming offline from other sectors to use in the renewable sector until you get increasing volumes from that sector itself. And that's sort of driven by the dynamics on the right-hand side. If we're looking at, giving an example from aluminum there, we're showing in the dark purple bars how primary demand is increasing to meet our installation projections. And then you don't get waste volumes, the lighter blue things, accumulating until later on in the system. And they build up slowly because it's mainly early failure that we get in the next 10 to 20 years before you get significant volumes of end-of-life solar coming off based on significant higher volumes of installation. Next slide, please. And then if you think about that economies of scale problem I showed you earlier, these installations aren't evenly distributed across the country. And we're doing some work now looking at how those waste volumes are projected to fall across provinces, and then thinking about what that means about regional systems we need to put in place and regional infrastructure and regional capacities for recovering materials. We see we have higher volumes earlier of waste streams coming off Ontario because Ontario installed more volume early on than in Alberta and BC and so on. And so you have to think about those regional disparities as well. Next slide. So that was wind and solar. We also look at this for EV battery scenarios, looking at hitting 2035 targets for no new internal combustion engine sales based on the EV availability standard we have here in Canada. And what we're showing here is for one particular assumption around what battery composition looks like, based primarily on nickel cadmium battery technologies. I'm showing sort of the material demand and the increase over time to meet those standards. We show a significant increase in demand for batteries through to about 2035 to meet the standard, and then moving steady on there to sort of keep, sort of hit projections of what vehicle demand is going to be. And the core point is here, the standard sort of driving the steepness of that increase. And if you flip to the next slide, you then have a corresponding increase in waste following a lag based on lifetimes in vehicles and assumptions about that. And the important thing about that, if we flip to the next slide, is that if we then think about, again, the potential to offset demand based on recovery within the sector, what you see is, I'm here showing here for copper and nickel, the solid line is if we don't recover and recycle anything, how demand is projected to increase through to 2050, right? You hit the standard in 2035, and then you move from there. The dashed line, the one that steeply declines, is if we assume 100% recovery and reuse right back to offset primary demand at the end of in-vehicle life. And you see, because of, we have about a 10 to 15 year lifespan in cars, we're actually not helping much to get to the 2035 standard with recovery, but we start to have increasing volumes after that to offset demand, and we bend it back down towards 2050. The middle one is thinking about other circular strategies. What if we take those batteries and we don't immediately put them through recycling, but we think about the waste hierarchy and we reuse them for things like standalone storage? Well, you see that reuse probably offsets demand other places, but it means you're not flowing as much volume back to the system, so you're offsetting demand in other sectors with increased primary demand in this sector. And we have to think about those trade-offs and how we're competing across sectors and where that demand is going to come from. So anyways, that's a whirlwind sort of review of some of the work we do, and as mentioned, just highlight the fact that if we're thinking about both the demand to decarbonize and the waste volumes it's going to generate, it's not easy to just say we have to recycle more to offset that demand. The lag in between means we have a period where if we want to be offsetting primary demand to decarbonize, we're really looking for sources from other sectors. We're going to be competing for increasing demand for resources for electronics, buildings, defense, until the decarbonized systems get up to speed and are going. And that also means we need to think more seriously about the circular strategies we're using in the mining sector, because we are going to continue to need primary material to meet those targets. And so how are we producing the minerals that we're producing more sustainably to get there, to where we have higher volumes of secondary materials? I'll stop there.
Thanks, Geoff. It's good to have data-driven discussions these days, and that one is I always find very informative in terms of just putting the imperative on the line. What do we really have to work with? And I think Geoff's last comments are a great segue to Bryony. Bryony Clear Hill, I first met in Helsinki, actually. It was, we were at the World Circular Economy Forum a couple of years ago, and we collaborated with the International Council on Mining and Metals, where she is now the Director of Innovation, and talked through a number of these issues in the Nordic context there and others. And again, we're shifting to, if we accept the fact that primary materials are going to be an ongoing part of our future, then how do we ensure that those primary materials are extracted in a way that don't transgress planetary boundaries and in fact generate value and regenerate materials, nature, and communities in a way? So, Bryony, thanks.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I'm just going to address the elephant in the room. Mining is not always, doesn't always have the best image, but it is a big elephant in the room that we need a lot more metal. And I've got a different report here, but it really does build on everything that Geoff has shared. Just sharing the number of new mines that we're going to need for different metals to meet a variety of different decarbonization pathways. So depending on which one you look at, it's just a slightly different calculation. But essentially, for some of these metals, we're going to need 60 or more new mines to be meeting the demand that we're looking at. And we know that recycling isn't going to do it all. We know that we're just not going to have the volume for a bit of time. A lot of that metal is still locked up in use. And there's also the issue that when we were building the first generation of wind turbines, solar panels, cars, we weren't building them for recovery. And so it's not just as simple as melting them down, getting the metal back. We've got huge issues with things being alloyed, things being in very small amounts, not being easily recoverable. So the organization I work for, ICMM, is an industry association for the mining industry, but not in the traditional sense of an industry association. We don't do any lobbying, we don't look at pricing, we purely focus on responsible mining and how really we bring together a third of the industry, and we look for those opportunities where a third of the industry, 24 companies, can do something that one company on its own couldn't do. So using that collaboration and also being CEO-led. So our council is made up of the CEOs of these 24 companies. And a few years ago, we turned our attention to circularity. And we went out and we spoke to the mining companies, we spoke to real thought leaders in the circularity space, we spoke to our value chain, we spoke to regulators, and we had a huge range of conversations from, why are you here? Mining can never be circular, you can't regrow metals, to, oh, we recycle our cups in the office, so we're good, we're all fine. And over time, we had more conversations, and we really realized that there were two opportunities to look at circularity for mining and metals, both of which we've touched on already. And they are brought together in the model that we've got here. So at ICMM and with our members, we talk about process circularity, which is how can we use the principles of circularity to make the mining process more efficient, to reduce our impact on planet, to maximize the benefit to people. And then on the other side, we've got product circularity, which is how can we make sure that the products we're producing, the metals that we're producing, are being used in the right way. As Alan alluded to, these metals are potentially infinitely recyclable if we're using them in the right way. Their properties don't change over time. You can just keep on using them and using them. But to do that, you need to have the right systems in place. And so this is how we see circularity. Firstly, you have to produce the material in the right way. And secondly, you have to make sure that it stays in use. You have to keep it circulating. And the mining industry has a role in both sides of this. So just to share a few examples of what this actually looks like in practice. On the process circularity side, some of you might be familiar with the term tailings. So this is the largest waste stream in the world. It's basically all the waste that's left behind after the mining process. So a mixture of rock, chemicals, water. It's incredibly difficult to store. And it's a huge challenge for the industry. It's a big risk, and it takes a huge amount of effort to safely store it. There's a huge amount of work happening at the moment looking at opportunities to either reduce the amount of tailings that's being produced, so as you're producing it, diverting it into other uses. And I put Vale on here as an example. They're producing sand out of the iron ore process, mining process. And so not only does that mean that they have an additional product that they're able to sell, but it's also reducing the amount of primary sand mining that's needed. So it's circular in a few different ways. There's other companies that are looking at many other technologies to do with tailings, but really looking to reduce and even in some cases eliminate the production of tailings, which is such a massive waste stream. I can't tell you how big these facilities are if you haven't seen them. So the circular opportunities here are huge. A slightly different example comes from Boliden, who are a big mining company in Scandinavia, and they're using excess heat from the smelting process and diverting that into the kind of national power grid, basically producing electricity from the steam. So something that you wouldn't even necessarily think of as waste, just heat that's being produced, but they're able to divert that, some of it going directly to heat houses and some of it going into a local industrial park. So just a couple of examples of what circularity can look like in the mining process. I'm not going to pretend that this is happening at every mine all around the world. There is a huge amount of work to do to make these processes business as usual, but it is starting, and companies are realizing that actually this just makes total business sense. If you're not having to manage as much waste, if you're able to make money from something that previously you had to manage, and you're reducing your impact, which is helping you meet your sustainability commitments, it's helping you meet regulation, it's just a massive benefit. And then if we move across to the product circularity side, so there are definitely companies out there who are specialist metal recyclers and reprocessors, but interestingly, a lot of the big mining companies are now getting involved in this as well. So Teck, for example, over in British Columbia, for a long time have been recycling lead batteries, and an entire ecosystem has built up around their trail operations, where other businesses have popped up and are helping with that value chain. And then Glencore is another example. So they're a massive mining company and a trader, but a huge part of their business now is directly recycling e-waste. So they're operating e-waste facilities in North America and in other parts of the world. And the thing here is they're able to put it back through their smelters, And in some cases, you can really optimize the smelting process by carefully mixing the amount of primary and secondary, and there's just all these extra benefits that come from it. So that's how we look at circularity in the mining and metals industry at the moment. You have to firstly get the mining process right, and there's a huge amount we can learn from circularity to optimize these processes, and then we need to keep the metals in use. We're not there yet. There's a huge amount more work to do, as I said, to make sure this is happening at every site around the world, but it's an area of a lot of interest at the moment and lots of progress happening. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryony. We could spend a day at least, perhaps a week, looking at the opportunities that are emerging there and working from what I think it was the first World Circular Economy Forum that we did online during COVID, and we had Mark Cutifani, a CEO of Anglo American at the time, and he said it's time to move from being mining companies to being materials solution providers. And that sounds like cute rhetoric, but it's actually a business model. And what we're looking at is as information providers, energy providers, and materials providers, it's a very different business, and it's a vastly increased business. So exploring what that means and finding out those examples, talking more about them, is going to be super important. But I'd like to shift gears a little bit and move talking more into the regional economies, the recovery side of this, and what it takes to have local and regional economies tap into this above-ground resource. John Holm, who's Senior VP at Pyxera Global, has done a remarkable amount of work around the world, but also very focused on the community benefit, the community economy, the regional economy, and how we can use this infinitely recyclable resource to the benefit of local people, local economies, and of course, by convention, the planet. Thanks, John.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And how's everyone doing today? Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, give yourself an applause. I mean, come on now. It's after lunch. You're getting some slides here, getting some really good information and knowledge, but thank you for the time and being here, and thank you so much for the invitation. A little bit of context of why I'm here. The organization that I work for, Pyxera Global, is a nonprofit focusing on aligning the public, private, and social sectors together to solve solvable problems one community at a time. And one of the work and streams that I get to lead is really building these large-scale coalitions, identifying the right public, private, and social sector partners to come together to solve what we call a solvable problem. And one of those is around supply chain. And so what I want to walk through with you today is this emerging opportunity that we're creating and co-creating with a bunch of like-minded partners, and really want to think about this in the current geopolitical context of which we're operating in. And so before we go into a little bit of context on the Circular Supply Chain Coalition itself and its relevance actually to Canada or North America, I would say, US and Mexico and more, is more just the high-level meta context that's framing everything in these conversations today. And so want to talk a little bit about the work that we do. We view circular economy as a behavior mechanism, behavior change mechanism around reduce, reuse, repurpose business models that helps us fundamentally work within the planetary boundaries to solve climate, but also find economic value. Those things are not mutually exclusive. And so when we're working together, one of the things we saw in the space was policy and subsidies. And so if you look at it right now in the environment, last year alone, $17 trillion alone was given to the oil and gas and petrochemical industries for subsidizing extractive business models, right? Extraction, chemical recycling, direct air capture, carbon capture, green hydrogen. When you really look at those investments, this is where it becomes an opportunity. What if some of those investments were subsidized into reuse behavior, about subsidizing onshoring supply chain to prioritize local value chain over global supply chain and really bring a bandwidth or value to the work that we're doing in the communities that we live in. And I want to acknowledge also the people that are not in the room, the ones working in those communities who have those behaviors, who are working in this space, who have a lot of deep knowledge which we can learn from. And so when you look at the policy landscape high level, there's that. And then a little bit going on right now. Right now you have 101 global conflicts happening. you have climate change, which is emerging, which is disrupting supply chain, and then you have China's control 95% of all refining and mining of critical minerals across the world. And so when you frame that right now, when you talk to industry, which we're talking was in Silicon Valley last week, there's an emerging opportunity here. The conversation is now about environment, social, governments. It's about making products, keeping your lights on, and being competitive. So how, when we look at this, this coalition that we're looking right now, be of value to you? A lot of the work that also we're framing at Pyxera Global, a lot of the work is creating this model in the US, but also looking at the US as a North American market. So what if we reimagine trade scenarios with critical minerals and free trade zones in Canada and Mexico, Europe with regulation, and Singapore and beyond? So on that note, I want to just provide a little bit of context on this opportunity. This is an implementation group. The Circular Supply Chain Coalition was originally funded by FedEx with the goal of standing up reverse logistics hubs and spokes around the United States and the globe, where you can bring the speed, scale, and quality into a hub around materials with commoditized value. So materials without commoditized value. That means materials that are on stock exchange, that are traded for, which have a clear line of sight economically. So any materials that are not commoditized, we are not including in this process right now. One specifically is plastic, if that comes up. Plastic's important, but it's not a commoditized value. So when you see this coalition, we're trying to really focus on those materials that are known to be recyclable, reused over and over again, and the ones that we can really find economic value moving forward. So we got a little bit about extractive mining today, but how many people in the room have heard the concept urban mining? All right, we have a lot of that, right? Yeah, great. So one thing that we're looking at urban mining, which is really valuable, especially in some conversations we're having in the US, is that you take your smartphone, right? How many people have electric waste in your homes that's just sitting there? It's not being used. Come on. Like everybody, right? Yeah. So if the government incentivized you maybe $50 to send that to a hub to actually be deconstructed, would you all do that for some of the material you have in your house? Like the majority of people probably yes. Our version of urban mining is that. It's not necessarily just a landfill, the minings and the tailings, which we talked about, but it's also creating the subsidies and incentives to actually take the existing waste, to take this material that's already created and create an incentive and subsidized platform to return it, deconstruct it, and use it. So when you look at the Circular Supply Chain Coalition's team, one of the team members that was the ex-head of global trade and reuse for Apple. We have one of the heads of waste management, which is a United States landfill team on our team. Our job is to really think through that entire chain, that entire supply chain, and really make it economically efficient for companies to engage on, to actually look at least partitioning some of their feedstock domestically in the US, in Canada, in Mexico, in Europe, Singapore, the globe, to where it makes economic sense as an economic hedge, not just deep sea mining and not just extraction. And so what you see on this slide is just, now the data is from 2022, we're trying to get it updated. We have some more relevant data in here, and as we heard from Geoff earlier, he may have some. But what I'm trying to make the point here, this is not a supply issue. We have plenty of supply. We just don't have the incentives or subsidies to bring the demand to actually make this work. And so one of the problems we're trying to solve is that. So when you look at what we're trying to create, when you look at industry, we're trying to think through three things. One, for many of you in the industry sector, you know your supply chain is overburdened right now. We talked to one tech sector partner. They have 6 people managing their entire global supply chain. So they don't have the internal mechanisms to be so nimble to move to domestic localization of feedstocks. It's really challenging. So with our group, we're trying to help solve that problem through a forward procurement mechanism. 2, really looking at pre-competitive collaboration. So if we're working with Schneider Electric and they're working with Cummins, and then Cummins works with Volvo, for example, that is a supply chain that's already in place that we can work on harmonizing and really trying to find economic value already. And then 3, this integrated hub and spoke model, which I'll share with you later of what that really looks like. But imagine an ecosystem of where you get a hub. Let's say I'll use America for a second here with Atlanta, Georgia. And you have 3 cities that are feeding in e-waste. So batteries, semiconductors, and other forms of consumer electronic products coming in at scale. So we're getting speed, we're getting volume, and we're getting quality. And then you bring in FedEx logistics partners. And by the way, logistics is not really ever talked about that much in this space, but it's so critical. Rail, car, air. How do you harmonize logistics to make it economically feasible to develop this hub and spoke model? I would say some of this work with our partners with Climate Kick in Europe is going a lot quicker because the regulation allows this to happen. But I also see Canada and the work that you're doing right now a little bit more nimble to be able to move this way. And the United States, I would say, are laggards, but we're trying to find a marketplace to catch up. So when you look at this model, this is kind of the goal in the span right now where we are. We're looking to set up 5 hubs in North America, 2 hubs in Europe, and 1 in Singapore right now. We're looking really at the beginning, the waste streams we're really trying to focus on, I'm going to come back to that last one in a second, is really focusing right now on the tech and automotive industry because they're in the most pain, especially because of the tariffs happening right now. And then really trying to leverage the resource around batteries, semiconductors, and e-waste, and really trying to focus on the market percentage there. Right now, we're in the process of looking at policy, subsidies, incentive procurements, leveraging some of the great work that's happening in the EU around social procurements, leveraging some of that work that's potentially in Canada and the US to provide frameworks for that. And then really getting the private sector to engage with us, like really deeply. And so when you see this model here, also look that this can be nimble. These are the cities, so Buffalo, Cleveland, Atlanta, Texas, which is Austin or Plano, and then we have an opportunity right now with the state of Colorado to set up our hub right now. Also, California is there. Does not mean that Vancouver and Seattle are not there. Does not mean that potentially there's places where we want Toronto to be there, Ontario. We just have not built that out yet, and I'm in need to have discussions with you folks to kind of figure out what that looks like. So on that note, I just want to leave it that that's an emerging process. I want to jump back to one thing there, and that's this: policy perspectives. You folks in this room, you're a lot more nimble this way than the US is. The US, we have to be state-led, not federal government-led, especially in these times right now. But when you look at this opportunity, whatever you're doing around reuse, I would say that Alan said it really clearly, we're not going to recycle our way out of this. How do we get out ahead of it right now and use the geopolitical situation we're in as an opportunity to define new business models, scale existing reuse, repurpose models that actually have financial value, and really think through risk mitigation and supply chain security in a new way. Because if we're not, we're in a little bit of trouble. So thank you for your time, and look forward to continued engagement.
Thanks, John, and for your discipline and time. There's so much more that we can dive into, and hopefully as this comes forward, we'll have a chance to hear some questions. And of course, we think of these things as the beginning of conversations, not the end. So we're really looking forward to ongoing work and the sweet spot between John's work and Bryony's work and others. We're going to hear more about this question of logistics, infrastructure, and investment related to building that capacity, whether it's about moving primary materials in for more local process valuation, whether it's capturing more out of existing mined and tailings, or whether it's capturing waste streams in a way that work on regional materials flow. So with that, I'd like to thank the first panel, and I'm going to I'm going to say thank you to Geoff. We'll be following up on that and looking forward to his next round of research on this. And I'm going to bring up 3 other folks who are going to be working with us on the next stage, which is a dialogue on unpacking challenges and opportunities. Brian Nicholson, who will coming up, Isabel and Paul Steenhof. And we're going to ask Bryony and John to stick with us. So come on in, have a seat. And I've given some initial just prompting questions, but I'm going to ask each of them to speak to those from their really distinct measures of opportunity and experience. And maybe Brian, I will start with you. And Brian is a director of the Energy Futures Lab, which is part of the overall Generate Canada family. And been doing some really, really interesting work on what does the regional hub and spoke look like? What are the kinds of investments that are required? And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what he's learned in the gatherings of his approach. The question, I'll just read it out. When you think about increasing Canada's capacity for processing raw critical materials in ways that contribute to green energy transition, what do you see as the key private and public investments that will be needed to move in that direction? So Brian, you can take it sitting down, or if you're more comfortable standing up, we'll just ask you to take about 8-10 minutes and give us your thoughts on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alan. I appreciate it. These are comfortable chairs. I think
Okay.
that's it. I don't have a presentation or any slides for you folks, but yeah, it's a really interesting question. I've been asked to provide the regional perspective from Western Canada, and I think that's really important to do so because we have a vast and beautiful country here with a great deal of, or I should say, massive disparity across the regions, and it just doesn't make sense to take the same policy approach to the whole country. So what is working really well here in Quebec is not necessarily going to have the same great impacts in Saskatchewan or the Northern Territories. And I think similar to you, Alan, I'm coming here to Montreal with a great deal of respect and interest in the leadership that the Quebec government has shown in the space. I think both Quebec and Ontario, they figured out a long time ago what they're looking for from this critical minerals sector. And they had the Plan Nord as well as Ontario. They had the Ring of Fire strategies. And they had a really good understanding of what the private and public investment was required in order to make that a reality. They've been working with industry as well as the federal government ever since to make it happen. But in the west and the north of Canada, however, we've been a lot slower to the game. John, you just had that slide there, and more often than not, when they show North America, the western part of our country is just used to put the graphics so you could show what all the other things playing out in the rest of North America. So we don't necessarily have that same clarity of purpose and action in this space. So there's obviously a lot of talk about mining because there's great assets there in the west and the north, but it's less clear in terms of how we plan on integrating these regions into the national supply chain as well as global supply chains. So to answer your question, Alan, I think I'll approach it from talking about some of the challenges that we need to overcome in the west and the north. And that's not necessarily just unique to the west and the north. And three in particular come to mind. First of all, as we all here know, over the last 2 decades, and we don't often talk or think about this, we have largely outsourced the industrial capacity and in specifically the processing and refining of critical minerals to Asia, in particular China. And this, to the extent that on a global basis right now, they're referring to this as the missing middle because good chunks of the Western world, they no longer have any of that refining capacity domestically. Another term that I often hear referred to is the great materials disconnect. So when we're talking about building a more vertically integrated and secure supply chain for Canada, there's a very large and important segment of that or chain within the middle that is missing at this point in time, and that's the processing and refining of these critical materials. So a friend of mine, Greg Moffat from the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, he often brings up the point that critical minerals are just rocks until someone adds chemistry to it. And here at this event, perhaps I'll be a little contentious, and I'll say that post-consumer materials will continue to be just waste until someone reprocesses and refines those materials. But that chemistry capacity in the middle of the supply chain, it matters a great deal. And relative to our peers in Asia, we just don't have a lot of it specifically here in Canada and arguably across the rest of North America. So as a result, our mines and metal recyclers, they have a lot smaller market to sell into relative to their peers in Asia. And not only that, our manufacturers have to look abroad for their feedstocks. And in many cases, we have to export all these kind of recovered materials as well as our raw products to foreign countries. And therefore, we forego the benefits associated with that integrated supply chain as well as a circular supply chain. Secondly, in the prairies as well as the north, we don't have access to that abundant, affordable, clean hydropower that you would find in other parts of the country. So throughout large swaths of Saskatchewan as well as Alberta and the Northern Territories, a lot of the mines and the facilities that are dependent on the combustion of hydrocarbons in order to power their facilities. And these are very energy intensive as well as emissions intensive processes. And so when a site selection company is working on behalf of these sophisticated refining companies from around the world, one of the top criteria that they're looking for is access to this clean power, which that particular region in Canada, we don't have a great deal of. Thirdly, because of the extremely decentralized as well as distant nature of our population base in the west and the north, the aggregation of these strategic materials, both the primary as well as the secondary ones, are extremely logistically difficult. So thank you for bringing that up, John. Very expensive, and it's challenging to get those economies of scale to be able to compete on a cost basis. So coming back to the question, Alan, in terms of investment solutions, in terms of what those public and private investments need to be, I'm a recovering government relations practitioner, so it's not surprising that I'm going to place a lot of the responsibility or onus on the government. I spent a lot of time in government, so I could say that just fine. But first and foremost, I think it's imperative that governments in both the west and the north of Canada are at least aware of, and they care about that missing link in our primary supply chain. Yeah. I would argue that it's no longer possible to leave it solely up to the market to have that midstream develop on its own. Western Canada has a long history of just being hewers of wood and drawers of water, and that's an important lesson for us to take as we consider the development of this sector, considering it's supposed to provide that economic well-being as well as national security for us. So targeted government initiatives are needed to support the build-out of this midstream in particular, which can creates not only a demand draw for the upstream mining companies as well as metals recycling companies in Canada, but also a supply push into the downstream manufacturing sector within Canada as well. So in essence, we'd be seeking to create a larger domestic offtake community for Canadian miners as well as recyclers, as well as a larger community for the supply of feedstocks for our manufacturing community. So the first policy tool that comes to mind, not surprisingly, from a government relations person is incentives. And when you think of everything west of Ontario, other than Saskatchewan Research Council's rare earth processing facility, it's usually a second thought or an afterthought when thinking about where are our products going to go and how do we support the further value-add manufacturing. And why do I say Ontario or west of Ontario? Is because the Ontario government, it's my understanding, is actually doing a pretty good job with their critical minerals innovation fund that provides incentives for firms to not only process but also recycle materials. And the federal government has also been coming around with several programs as well, and it's my understanding that they're quite eager to support processing projects within the West, but there's just not a whole bunch of abundance for them to support at this point in time. So I think it's important to note that it's not just government one-off incentives for companies. There's several other policy tools that are possible. And in the West and the North, just like Ontario and Quebec, obviously there's a big role for government to play in terms of building out infrastructure, both electricity as well as transportation, that can unlock not only single projects, but multiple projects, both in the upstream as well as the midstream. And ideally, this is multi-use infrastructure that, where you have the rail lines as well as the power lines and the roads that are allowing not only companies to thrive, but communities to thrive, as well as our Canadian Armed Forces to perhaps project sovereignty up north. There's also regulations and initiatives associated with the battery passport, so to provide more transparency about what critical materials are inside our gadgets as well as our vehicles, so it allows Canadians to make more informed decisions about supporting their domestic supply chain. There's several countries out there that are actually developing strategic critical mineral reserves. And we could do that potentially in Canada, where we would source only critical minerals from Canadian mine sites as well as Canadian metal recovery and recycling firms as well. Public investment could also go into retraining, let's say, engineers, process engineers, chemical engineers from the oil and gas sector, so they could retransition into perhaps being extractive metallurgists. But the problem is, I think, in the West, is that we don't truly understand at this point in time how we could better position ourselves to compete within or to actually position ourselves in the supply chain for the rest of Canada as well as the rest of the globe. And this is where I'd suggest, Alan, that we direct our public and private investment for this point in time as it pertains to the West and the North. And it's developing a more purposeful plan of how to compete and where governments could best play that role. And I think what would be a no-regrets move for governments at this point in time would be, as well as industry, to invest in the ecosystem as a whole. And that sounds pretty broad and vague, but what that potentially could look like is what Quebec figured out in 2015 timeframe. They established this Société du Plan Nord. It's my understanding it's a coordinating entity that operates in between industry, indigenous communities as well as government. And that's something that we're seeking to build out in the West. And it's to bring together all these various constituency groups under a common purpose of more quickly as well as comprehensively integrating the West into the national supply chain for Canada as well as global supply chains. So it's our understanding that no one government, no one company could do this on their own, and that's why it's important to actually invest in the ecosystem around it. Thanks a lot, Alan.
Thank you. And I'd just like to add that the work that you're doing on the ground has been really impressive, like just doing a lot of deep homework with a lot of companies, looking at infrastructure gaps, looking at this. So beyond the good ideas, your homework is being done, and I think it's really something we could all learn from. So, and your reference to taking the time to invest in a more coordinated plan, taking it forward as we've learned from others about pathways is probably wise advice. We're going to shift from that focus on what the government can do to work with industry to what it feels like to be inside industry and being a company that is working as a core supplier for lithium, and something we've all heard a lot about. Isabel Sear is the Director of Public Affairs and Communications Technology. And Isabel, as a company that's deeply embedded in the circular economy of the key critical material, I mean, if people know one material, it tends to be lithium or cobalt, and you're right at the heart of that. What are the primary sort of policy and market implications or impediments that you would like to see addressed so that you could get back to your core business of giving us and the lithium we need for the future? So go ahead.
Sure, I'll stand up for this. I do have a couple slides that I want to go through, but before I'll answer your question, so Lithion Technologies is a company that was founded in 2018. It's a relatively new company, and it didn't emerge because of a government policy or because of an incentive. It really emerged because of a need. So Quebec has about 300,000 ZEVs, so EVs and plug-in hybrid vehicles currently on the road. It has about 50% of Canada's stock of electric and hybrid vehicles that are in circulation in Canada. So there was really a need to process these materials, and if anyone has ever seen how an EV is built, you have the battery that's at the bottom of the car, and it's something that can be 5-6 feet long. The average battery weighs almost a ton in weight. So it's not something that you'll find in your drawer like you would find your old iPhone or your old computer. So it's something that needs to be treated at the auto recyclers and also at all the different portions of the supply chain that you see on the slide here. So we have had barriers along the way. All new companies do. There are two main barriers that I would say that we've had to surmount and that we are still working on surmounting. One of them would be getting some capital to be able to scale up. So we were very lucky in 2021 and 2022 during our Series A funding. We had a lot of attention. This was the era of IRA, and the market also had a lot of money to supply the battery chain with capital. We raised $125 million. ICMM, a South Korean fund, and GM Ventures became an investor in our company. We had the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, Blinken, come and visit our pilot plant that had been running since 2020. So a lot of success there, and now we are at a critical juncture where in order to continue to scale up, we need more capital. Unfortunately, a lot of the battery space in North America and Europe hasn't done very well. So that capital has dried up, and it will continue to be an issue for everyone along the chain. The second the second burden or the barrier that we've had to scaling up our operation and coming online were regulatory burdens. So we have laws that were put in place in the 90s to protect the environment of hazardous materials and dangerous goods, residual dangerous goods, that has not been put in place with the EV market in mind. So we have these batteries that are coming at the end of life, or the non-conform products or battery scrap from the battery plants that have a lot of value in them. When you look at, this is really, we talked about urban mines earlier, this is really a rich urban mine, because unlike when you look at the lithium in the soil and the cobalt and nickel in the soil, the concentration of these minerals in a used battery is a lot higher than it is in nature. So we've had difficulty. You require a permit to treat used batteries, you require a permit to store it, you require a permit to transport it. So we've had recently an investor presentation where one of our assets, it's all these permits that we've amassed from Transport Canada, from ECCC, from the EPA, from the Ministry of the Environment at the Quebec level, and each time it requires a lot of time to get that permitting in place. And if we want the industry to set up and to be able to support us on the logistics end, we need to reduce those barriers and ensure that it is easier to recycle and reuse the metals in a used battery, so that has to be easier than sending it to the US to get treated or landfilled, or even using technologies that don't revalorize all the metals. So there are other options to treating hazardous waste materials, and we are actively communicating with the government to ensure that there are some changes made to current regulations that that really favor the circular economy. And there's a lot of opening right now from the government. It's just very complex. One thing that I've learned from working in the hazardous material space is that it's a lot easier to add a regulation than to change existing regulations and laws. And the major issue that we have, at least in Quebec, is with the law and not a regulation. So that becomes more challenging, the definition. And then, of course, at the federal level, the definition is also something that's part of the Basel Convention. It's something that the US didn't sign, so the used batteries in the US fall under universal waste. It's a lot easier to treat and transport and store in the US than it is in Canada. So this slide shows you the supply chain. I think it's something that's very important to understand in the used battery space. So we can take materials from the cathode and anode manufacturers, so there are powders and non-conforming product that they really can't reuse and recycle themselves that can come to us. We will take wet and dry rolls of off-spec cells. We can take off-spec modules and battery packs. And in a nascent industry, the levels of non-conforming product or production scrap is extremely high because we are working to get them down to a certain level. And there was this race to get up to production, to scale up very quickly in North America and Europe, which have left us with rates of non-conforming products that sometimes reach 50, 60%. And this is going to go down over the years. So what we're seeing in China is that the rate of production scrap is under 1%. So as these new plants come online, there's a need to recycle just because of the value that's in them and also the need to reuse them. Eventually, so right now it's a 70-30 split. 70% of the materials that are available to be recycled are coming from battery plants. 30% are coming from the end-of-life product. At the end of life, we'll have material that will come from energy storage, or reused second life batteries, from dealers, from other, so we do recycle smaller. We're very concentrated on recycling EV batteries, but we do recycle smaller batteries as well, as long as they're lithium-ion batteries. And then, of course, car recyclers. So this gives you a good idea of where we interject. And of course, everything that comes out of our plant needs to qualify for product to be able to come back into the supply chain. So our solution, and most battery recyclers' solution, is in 2 steps. So when I say battery recyclers, I really mean lithium-ion batteries. The first step is really a mechanical separation of the concentrated critical minerals, something that's called black mass in the industry. And what we've put in place in our St. Bruno plant, our commercial plant on the South Shore of Montreal, is we also separate out the copper and aluminum because there's a lot of value in them. We separate out heavy and lighter plastics as well, which has a lot less value. But we're able to extract 98% of the critical minerals contained in used batteries. So we're able to recover all of that. And then the second step of the process, which we are currently doing at the pilot level in Anjou, is hydromet. And this is a technology that exists. It's nothing really novel. But of course, you've said it so well, we've lost our refining capacity and know-how. The operational know-how is something that needs to be built back up in North America. So right now in North America and in Europe, we do not have any commercial level hydromet to be able to take that black mass and bring it back to battery material. So we've been able to do it at the pilot level, but we haven't been able to do it commercially. And the reason is, it's not because of lack of government support. The government has pretty much, in the past year, given $1 for every $1 of private money coming in. It's really a lack of private money in Canada. China has taken a bet about 15, 20 years ago. They've bet on a paradigm shift, and they've invested and they've created demand for that space, and they are really ahead of us in terms of having the infrastructure to be able to recover most of those metals and having the infrastructure to be able to bring those metals back to battery grade level, and they are put back into the cells. So this is something that we need to work on. The advantage of doing all this and having that 2-step process is we are reducing the demand on the mines, of course, but we're also doing it in a way that's much more eco-friendly. So we are doing it within our planetary boundaries. The urban mine, and I say urban mine, but what I really mean is our technologies compared to mining, and this is something, the study that was done by a third party using an ISO standard. What the urban mine has is the opportunity to reduce the emissions 4-fold, the opportunity to reduce the water usage 96%. So in our plants right now, we reuse the water from our process, so we reuse it within our plants. It's a zero liquid discharge plant, and we have the opportunity to do that at the hydromet level as well. I wanted to leave on this note just to show you what's happening right now. So we have a production of black mass that's happening in Canada, the US, Europe, And what we're seeing in terms of where that product is going is there's a net export going from the US to Asia. So Asia is importing a lot of that volume to be able to reuse it in their batteries. So this gives you a bit of a sense of the importance of bringing that supply local. So we are able to treat black mass at our nickel smelters in Canada currently, the US as well. The problem with that is you lose the graphite is burnt, so you lose the graphite. You lose the lithium. The lithium goes into the slag, and it's uneconomical to try to recover it. And then you only recover 50% of the nickel and cobalt, and bringing those back to battery grade is very difficult at this point. And so on this, I believe I answered your question fully. So thanks for listening.
No, it's the work that you've done and the partnership with the Quebec government has been really exemplary. It's really kind of walking the talk through, and to have, it's a very interesting challenge that we've designed ourselves for environmental protection, but in many ways, and this was brought up in earlier panels as well, is that the next evolution of the environmental protection is the transition from waste to resource, and we're not well tooled for that yet, as you've described. And I think that's one example where kind of rationalizing that for new objectives while still managing for the real impacts that were intended to be is a critical piece of that puzzle. And that leads directly into our next discussion. Something that I've learned in the course of a number of these forums and dialogues is the importance of data and standards. If we're shifting into new territory and if we are managing for new values, how do we know when we're doing those well? And how are we going to be protected, the public? How are we protecting downstream and upstream users? How are we transferring value through supply chains? And our regulations aren't really designed to do many of those things well, especially in the current sort of more integrated approach. So that's why we've asked Paul Steenhof, who's the manager of strategic initiatives and environmental and business excellence at CSA, to talk a little bit more about the role of standards and how supply chain integrity and supply chain sort of optimization, how do we know that we can guarantee somebody at one end is getting what they're asking from the other, and that we can coordinate these in a way that works for business value, works for environmental protection, and allows us to track more closely, using things like the battery passport and others, a movement of materials safely through the environment. So, Paul, can you talk to us a little bit more about what you see as the role of standards in contributing to successful circular strategies for critical minerals?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, and I think there's some key areas I wanted to point out, and I think I also want to just lay out a bit of the context and maybe also some of the challenges, because there's multiple challenges with standards and that I'll speak to. But just to talk to you, some key areas that we see, and I think maybe also as context. CSA Group commissioned or worked with the Saskatchewan Research Council over the last couple of years to do research on the recovery and recycling of critical minerals, lithium and rare earths particularly, from waste streams. And that led to a published CSA research paper that we have published. So a lot of, I think, great information coming from that, which I'll draw a bit upon in my answer to you. But one of the areas that was highlighted was sustainability and measurement of sustainability across the value chain, and how that's reported and the data aspects of that too. So measurement of sustainability, including environmental, health, safety, and when we come to recovery from waste streams, there's a big health and safety aspect too. And then with the data and the data management, the issues of the emerging areas of digital product passports that really showcase the environmental and sustainability attributes across the value chain. So that research that we published, I think, really did highlight a couple key areas. But again, I'm just going to now come just a bit to the challenges that that exist. I'd say we talked a lot about China in this today in this panel discussion. China is dominating standards development when it comes to ISO international standards, and I fully recognize and appreciate the important role of industry associations that are developing industry-based standards. But really now I'm speaking more to ISO and international standards, where a lot of this work has been taking place the last couple of years. So as China's dominated the production of critical minerals, they also dominate the standardization in a sense of they are leading to the preeminent technical committees through ISO, TC 298, which is rare earths, and TC 333, which is lithium. And by leading it, they are chairing it. And I think that the challenge is that that they have the critical mass to really weigh in quite strongly into this, whereas maybe Canada is emerging player that has less economy of scale. So just for example, China has the ability to propose many standards, new proposals that because they have a lot of people that can basically pour into that. Just looking at that whole context of governance again, another challenge that we see is a lot of geopolitics now within ISO. So those two committees I talked about, now we have two more that are being chaired by European players, and a lot of the emphasis behind that is the EU regulations that deal with critical materials. So a lot of geopolitics now that has emerged into the standardization space. Canada has come to the table and I think is participating. But part of the challenge, I'd say, is Canada being a smaller player and with a relatively new industry in the sense of critical minerals and more rare earths. We don't have the critical mass of people to be involved. So that is a challenge, but I'd say an opportunity exists within within critical minerals. What has been really highlighted through both our research and also an international workshop agreement that was led through ISO was that circularity there's a strong need for standardization and also a gap. Whereas the upstream, the midstream, processing, that is, I think well covered. It's the downstream that's not. There's still a significant area of standards work that can take place. And I think Canada has an opportunity to really step up and lead. So as I said, Canada's now involved in those 4 committees that I mentioned. And we're looking, through CSA, we're looking to increase that activity as well.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Paul. And I do think that that sort of ties into that pathways and that path forward. How do we set those metrics? What are our expectations of performance at each level, and how do we know when we're getting there if we don't have an agreement on various forms of standards that meet different stages of the value chain? So it's not to underestimate that, the importance of getting more of a consensus around that. So thank you for that. As somebody who deals in the standard space a lot, I actually learned a lot through that, and it's interesting China's role in the standardization process along with everything else, and they're miles ahead of us. I would also argue that there are other producing nations like Australia. I was in Australia this fall, and Australia has produced its circular economy strategy, which includes a significant portion of work around critical minerals, and I know they're heavily involved in a number of European nations on manifesting this. So we got some catch up to do. And your reference on capacity building for standards development and this sort of work is also a good reminder. We're going to come back to John now. John's got a lot of work on the ground and a lot of very practical approach to bringing these community hubs together. And my question for you is, how can local businesses and governments best create the conditions for maximizing value and supply of critical minerals? So the local businesses and governments working together. And what's typically missing in these sorts of conglomerations to build the kind of capacity that would create the economies that are viable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's really important to tether out business a bit. You have industry, and then you have SMEs. And I think a lot of the work, especially in the US, a lot of the existing e-waste providers are typically small and medium-sized enterprises who are really just functioning day by day to survive. They're really not getting that scale. They're really not getting that demand. And so they're never going to get the volume, speed, and quality at the stage they can to really grow their business. And so one thing that we're focusing on is looking at a state level and looking at states who actually kind of understand this a bit and who want to get a competitive advantage, let's say, by investing in net positive subsidies or incentives to kind of tether these types of businesses together as an investment opportunity for, I would say, middle and long term for the state. So one example I'll give you is the state of Colorado. The state of Colorado has a policy in place right now where haulers are not allowed to dump critical minerals into landfills. So they have a glut in a place called Pueblo, Colorado, of all these big generators sitting there, and there's no marketplace to take them to. So what we're thinking through this model, we see the opportunity is working with local governments on more or less creating co-ops potentially around these e-waste providers together where they can get the speed, the efficiency, and the quality together, and get that power source to get to that hub and spoke model to work. And so I think one thing that states do that's missing is they can work together to tether together those SMEs, provides incentives and subsidies to allow those providers both independently but together to have more power, more voice in their work. The other place is industry. I think that, it's really funny. If you asked me 6 years ago when we were building out the coalition, it was really interesting. We were talking mostly to foundation, HR, corporate social responsibility hubs around ESG. Now we're talking to CFO, procurement, supply chain, R&D. And what that says is a signal that this is really a medium, not just a medium and long-term transition, but how do you get industry to understand that this is a competitive advantage opportunity for them? To really look at investing locally now, looking at it from mining rights. So as you would have a mine, well, if I invest in this hub and spoke model, and I can secure 25% of copper before anyone else, I have an incentive to do so. And so we're trying to frame the work now in that space. And then in our work at Pyxera Global, focusing on community advocacy and voice is really tethering together that community ownership piece in a way to where communities are owning that resource, that waste, which is sitting on their land and sitting in their space, which beforehand had no value besides leaching into the ecosystem, which is causing health issues many times. So I think, to summarize, look at states who can actually look at net positive investments as a positive business attraction for industry, working with industry themselves to get a competitive advantage over, I would say, domestic value chain over global supply chain as a risk mitigation phase. And then 3, getting communities to come together, so de-siloing them and connect them together to look at partnership in a different way instead of just running on fumes all day long and not really making progress.
Great. And in this era where that great east-west line that we're having has become a more contested line, the ways in which regions can cooperate, the ways in which materials flow can come, remains on the table, but it becomes a bit more challenging. I think a number of us are stubborn enough to think that this too shall pass, but it does create an opportunity in the isolation in the short term to really think about what you can work with in your own space with your own materials. So I think that's great. It'd be really interesting to get together and talk more about the Quebec example, lessons learned there, the Colorado example, for example, and really compare notes on how that can be mutually reinforcing and tie it back in with your work, Brian. And last but not least, and then I'll be looking to get some questions and reflections from you. So I think you're aware that the app has a questions tab. You can use that if you like, or you can also use the microphone. So, but Bryony, this idea of circularity initially I know was sort of seen as a bit of a threat, sort of something to replace the industry's hard-fought space as the builders of our infrastructure, and I think they've come along. A number of them have come a long way since that. So, I've been working in and around the mining sector for a long time, mostly in civil society and Indigenous groups. But if you'll permit me, I often find that the industry does a lot more talking than walking. They do a lot of good stuff. There's no question about that. But if you generalize across the industry, the talking happens a lot more than the walking, and that's not to underestimate the value of what is done. But given the size of the industry, they like to talk a lot. You'll forgive me for that, hopefully, or I'll get to the next beer as it may be. But what I'm finding really fascinating is that I'm seeing a lot of activity in the circular economy space, and maybe you can speak to this at some level because it confounds me. Nobody's talking about it. They're doing a lot of walking behind the scenes. They're making hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in this, and I'm aware of it because I'm in these circles. It's like, can't you just talk about your successes? Can't you show how this new value model, this new business model is creating success? Because it happens at many different ways and has, I think, yields many different values for what were traditionally mining companies. So I'd like to wrap up with, Bryony, your thoughts on how the industry, I know you can't generalize necessarily, is viewing the intersection between the critical minerals rush and the circular economy opportunity. There are some who really have drunk that Kool-Aid, some who are looking at it cautiously. But how would you characterize, where your constituents are, and perhaps some reflections on where kind of more of the breakthroughs can come?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's not an easy one. I think listening to everything today, and especially the numbers from Geoff at the start, I think we have moved from, or at least the more kind of progressive mining companies, and certainly a lot of those who operate in Canada would kind of be in that bucket, moving from seeing circular economy as a risk, or as a threat. So if you'd talked to them a few years ago, it would have been like, well, they would have either got very defensive of, well, recycling is never going to replace us, so we'll just keep doing what we're doing, or it would have been, a feeling that actually recycling is going to threaten their business, to now all of the numbers showing it's not either or. It's not primary mining or secondary recovery. We need both of them. And we're still, in some metals, going to be struggling to meet demand. And so we really do need to be looking at both of them. And I think there's kind of different opportunities and challenges alongside those. But in terms of how that's going to manifest, I think we're going to see different business models emerging. So there will probably be some current mining companies who are still primary miners in 20 years' time, but they are doing it in the most efficient way possible. They're net zero, nature positive, zero waste, all of these different things. And they're primary miners, but they're doing so very efficiently. There will be others who kind of diversify, and that's, I think, where the industry is at the moment, where we're seeing a number of the big miners that have secondary processing as part of their business. And that ratio might change. It might even change over time, depending on what the market looks like. But you'll see them becoming resource solution providers. That's the kind of term that you hear thrown around sometimes. But fundamentally, they're providing metal, whether that is primary mined or secondary. And then we might see others look into more innovative business models. So people get very excited about the idea of metals as a service, where you're selling the metal, you're almost renting it, but then the company has the right to get that back when the product reaches the end of life. Or companies that might move more into the kind of services space, so looking at traceability through the value chain. There's a huge range of opportunities, but I think it is starting to be seen as an opportunity rather than a threat. I think the key thing here, though, is that it can't be, when we think about primary mining, it can't be mining at any cost. And I think there's a real recognition in the industry, or at least within the kind of leadership group within the industry at the moment, that primary mining cannot be done at the cost of nature. We're providing the metals to meet the energy transition, but if as an industry we're not doing anything to mitigate our own emissions, then that's not going to fly. So in terms of that, I think there's kind of two key focus areas, one of which we've touched on, which is standards. So I think there's a recognition that any primary supplier that's entering use needs to be doing so with the right ESG credentials. And this is where at the moment, as you know very well, Alan, voluntary standards are a big part of kind of demonstrating responsible supply within the mining industry. There's a huge amount of focus at the moment on standards. There's a big initiative called the Consolidated Mining Standards Initiative that ICMM is involved in, Mining Association of Canada also involved. So making sure that primary metal is being produced in the right way and demonstrating that through standards. And then the other big thing is innovation. So I talked a little bit about tailings. Getting to zero tailings is incredibly difficult. And it's not something that the mining companies can do on their own. So we held a conference last year with MIT, bringing together academics, startups, mining companies, trying to work out what the ecosystem looks like, what are the different technologies that are available. It's the same when we look at the big mining haul trucks that are the size of houses. If you think it's difficult to electrify a car, try electrifying a truck that's then going to be carrying 300 tons uphill usually because of the way that mines work. So innovation is definitely going to be important in that kind of primary mining space. And then when we look at secondary, I think there's kind of two different stocks of secondary metal that we've started to talk on. There's the stock that currently exists, so the existing urban mine, which was not necessarily designed for recovery. So you've got all these materials out there that are either still in use or are in landfill, but they weren't necessarily designed with the intention that the metal would be taken back out. So it's really difficult in some cases to get that metal. It's been alloyed, it's in tiny amounts, it's hidden really deep inside these different products. It's not necessarily been designed with recovery, and that's where there's some really awesome companies doing this amazing work to kind of try and figure that out. But we must also remember that we're building new products now, and I don't think there's always the focus on making sure that those products that we're building now are being designed for recovery at the same time. So I think that's another area that the mining company can't deal with on its own because we're not building the products, but there's a potential for those companies that are interested in the secondary kind of space and in those new models to use the expertise they have around metals to kind of support with that design side. So that's kind of how I'd look at it. I think, it really has moved in a lot of companies' minds from being seen as something that is a threat to something that is an opportunity, but that's not going to look the same for every company. I think every company is going to have a slightly different mix of primary, secondary, doing a bit of both, looking at new opportunities. But however they do it, they need to be building those principles into the process, making sure that primary metal is entering the market with the right credentials, and that secondary, we're thinking about that kind of dual challenge of the existing stock and the stock that we're building today.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thanks very much for that. And I think as an industry observer for a long time, I've just seen what's happened in the last sort of 5 years, the kind of transformative, and I use that word carefully, is moved at a speed I hadn't anticipated, and I think that's partly because the market draw is there, and people starting to realize that the waste model that is been used for traditional mining, which gets like 0.5% byproduct and 99.5% waste, is perhaps not optimized, and that there are a variety of different ways to rethink that business model in a way that could really benefit companies, regions, and others. So it's a very interesting and exciting time, especially as it starts to go up and down the value chain. Mm-hmm. Remembering that these are industrial sites which are massive users of resources and services and others as well. So you're in the middle, not at the beginning. So that's an important and exciting piece. I'd like to see if anybody, I'll look on the app, but if anybody has any questions, comments, or reflections, no questions here, but I'm sure that one or two of you have a thought or two on the how to go. So please, and do we need microphones, or is that? Strong voice. Okay, maybe you stand up and project it back that way.
So thank you everyone for your insights.
opportunities because it's, there's so many things to do, so many, so I would like to know the opportunities where we can invest because we're not all big companies, but for small investors where there would be opportunities in your. So the question is, where are, for smaller scale investors who are wanting to contribute, on entrepreneurs, where do we see some of the gaps and where do you see the richest opportunities to position yourself to be part of the sort of circular economy around critical minerals? I'll open that to the floor. John, you probably have a thought or two.
I do, actually. A lot of it's interesting being around this ecosystem because there's a lot of emerging startups that are adjacent to the type of work we're doing. I'm sure you're seeing it too. One of it's robotics and looking at the intersection of AI into robotics and deconstruction, and really trying to be nimble on product disassembly is something that's emerging. That's a really interesting space, especially if you look at regulation supporting this type of work moving forward. The timing would be really well purposed. I would also say that when you're looking at this entire value chain across, or the supply chain across, so the external supply chain, which is really, we're trying to connect the dots on from smelters to OEMs to refurbishers to remanufacturers. There's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of gaps in the efficiency of making the economics work. That's one thing that we really see. So in that, I would say broadly, take that whole line and identify a gaps and needs analysis of where the opportunities are, especially if regulation opens wide for this to actually happen. That's a good time to come into the market.
Great. Isabel, your thoughts?
Sure, I can provide some insight in terms of the battery recycling supply chain. Well, the battery recycling in itself is part of a larger value chain, and it's the least capital intensive part of the whole chain when you look at the production of anodes and cathodes and cells and battery packs. So there's already that, but within that chain, there's a lot of support around it. I think that you talked about gaps. There's a lot of gaps currently in Canada. The storage of used batteries, it's a waste material. It requires a certain expertise in terms of storage, a certain permitting, and a lot of work as well to get your insurance to cover and the city to approve. And so there's a lot of need there to store the material, transport it as well. So there's a need for more logistics support in this space, I would say. And then at the OEM level, what we've heard is, so some OEMs, some automakers they really want to be supported by an ecosystem. And when they send us their batteries, we have to return a certificate of destruction. And currently what we're seeing is a lot of automakers are bringing all the batteries to a central point, diagnosing if something can be remanufactured, reused, or if it's destined for recycling. And that can be probably in the long term inefficient, so they will be looking for suppliers of diagnosis of battery health and basically the diagnosis and a recommendation on where your battery pack or battery should go. And when you think of the supply chain, those batteries end up at auto recyclers, dealerships. So they're very, very local markets. So there's a need to support at the local level diagnosis. So this is a space where I would see a lot of work can happen. And then further along the chain, I think in qualifying, so some lab support in qualifying products. One of the things that I learned is it's as we worked with our pilot plant, I saw the percentage of quality of our lithium, cobalt, and nickel go up, go down, and then go back up. And I asked our R&D, our CTO, why did it go up and then go back down? And the answer was, well, we didn't know we had to test for these impurities. So there's a big need as well to qualify the product, the black mass, the cobalt, the nickel, the lithium, all the products to qualify them. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there that can be interesting. If you look at the stats, Benchmark Minerals, which is an intelligence markets tool that we use to understand the market. What they've said is in the battery chain worldwide, we need $1.6 trillion in investment to get to 2040. So that's triple what we need to get to 2030. In the battery space, in the battery recycling space, the amount of investment from 2030 to 2040 needs to increase fivefold, from 26 billion to 151 billion. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the amount of investment that needs to that needs to go into the space for us to reach not only our carbon goals, but also for us to transition towards electric vehicles.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to chime in on that? Okay, we've got somebody at the speaker there, and I also have a question online, but please do go ahead.
Sure, thank you very much. I found this all very fascinating. Thank you for the multidisciplinary perspective on this. I have more of a familiarity with the oil and gas industry, so in my head I'm trying to draw some parallels. So about 10, 15 years ago, there was all this push for the big producers to start transitioning and looking at different energy mixes and whatnot. But now what we're seeing in the past few months even is a lot of them saying, you know what, we're just going to go back to our regular bread and butter. We're going to simplify and just focus on fossil fuels. So I'm trying to think of this with respect to the whole primary versus secondary. And what we're seeing, I'm hearing a lot of optimism of there's a chance, there's an opportunity here for the industry to transition to more metals provider regardless of where the source is. Is there a risk of us looking back 10, 15 years down the line and the industry saying, you know what, secondary, just too complicated. We're just going to go back to primary and just focus on that. And if there is that risk, or am I thinking of it wrong, is there something fundamentally different about metals versus energy sources that makes that less likely? Thank you very much.
That is a great question, and that learning from history is something that we certainly want to do, and it's been a bit of a sobering to see that. And Bryony, your thoughts on the differences or similarities? Or
that is such an interesting question. I do think it is fundamentally different because primary mining is getting harder because ore grades are declining. So we've mined a lot of the good stuff, and certainly if you look at copper and other metals, generally speaking, ore grades are declining, so we're producing more waste for the same amount of metal. So I think that is an element in it. I think also mining works on a very long time scale. And I'm not super familiar with oil and gas, but permitting can take decades for mining. So we need to be opening the mines now that, we need to be starting the permitting process. These mines might not be operating until the 2040s. So I think, there is some level of being able to deal with bumps in the road. I do think there will still be companies in a few decades' time who are primary miners because that's what they're very good at. They're operating in jurisdictions like Chile where they've got great copper. It makes complete sense. They know how to do it. They're doing it, increasingly efficiently. So I do think there are companies that will still do that. But I think if you look across the industry, I don't think this is a short-term trend, in my opinion. I think we're seeing enough of the big companies that are diversifying. They might just grow overall. They might be doing more primary and more secondary. But yeah, I think for various reasons, I don't think the parallel is quite there, but I might be wrong. We'll be at the Canadian Circular Economy Summit in 2035, and you can tell me I was completely wrong.
I think this also comes back to your point about the opportunities to apply circular economy principles to both product and process. And what we're seeing is an optimization opportunity. So you not only get more metals out of the ground, you reduce waste, you reduce liability, and you increase revenue as well as consolidating relations with local economies. So that's just not doing anything with secondary, and arguably there's hundreds of millions, if not billions, on the table just applying CE principles to the mine site. So I think that could, regardless of what's going to go ahead with the secondary, which for all your reasons, I think it's an existing stock above ground. But there's what I'm aware of is the kind of the waste inventories that are happening now on major mine sites, which never happened before. The siloing between products and processes on mine sites, which was just a matter of course is now being broken down, applying a number of these things. So if I'm a shareholder, let alone a stakeholder, I'm thinking, if you know these opportunities for improvement and revenue increase are available and you're not using them, I'm probably going to shift my money somewhere else. So that's another one of the differences, I think, is that optimization piece can go. I want to read the question from Amanda Berry. And how should Canada collaborate with other countries, for example, with the planned EU Critical Minerals Act and potential actions being taken elsewhere to control materials flow and assets, and access? So how do we learn lessons, develop partnerships, and develop an approach that gets our friendly partners' needs met while sharing a number of values that could be help with the value chain that we're interested in building through these kind of principles. Anybody want to take on the relationship with international partners, which isn't to exclude the U.S., but we may want to frame that slightly differently in the U.S. context.
Sure.
I'll start with Brian, then go to John.
I could maybe start things off a little bit. I believe that what we're trying to figure out in at least the west and north of Canada, right across Canada for that matter, are issues that are prevalent across many countries around the world. And there's several countries that already are leading the way and have piloted and tested different initiatives that we can just kind of transplant and try and pursue within Canada. So there's a lot of lessons learned, I think, and we could be, pursuing linkages with these international organizations that are a good way in which to help us learn and expedite our process and perhaps avoid those where things have not gone exactly well. So I think that would obviously, just from a lessons learned perspective, be something we want to pursue.
Yeah, I think the Critical Raw Materials Act is I hate to say it's a fascinating read. It's actually a really interesting piece of public policy because of its comprehensive approach. It deals with issues of colonization. It deals with primary, secondary flows, and it's a really thoughtful piece. And there's a shout out to Citra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. They commissioned a circular economy analysis of the Critical Raw Materials Acts. For all you geeks out there, you'll definitely want to pick that one up. But it's an international environmental IEEP is the name. I can never remember what the acronym actually stands for, but it's a circularity analysis of the Critical Raw Materials Act. And I think there's lots of lessons in things like that of how we think about the nature of the problem in its full complexity, and then just sort of start to think through our priorities. But John, what's your thoughts there?
Well, I was just going to actually reference the resource. A lot of the work we're looking is trying to leverage the circular economy policy going into the EU as a leverage for the U.S. in our work in the states that we're working in. And I do think there's a lot of leverage that you folks could garner and work together, especially in this current space. I do know that in Europe, circular economy has a very specific meaning in their procurement packages, what it looks like for business to engage. And I think that's a really good holding that can be leveraged. I did want to bring up in the U.S. context, just real quickly though, while all this noise is happening, I don't want to just be linear about it. If you look, for example, opportunities to move forward, you have 6 critical minerals in the U.S. that have just been stopped on import from China. There are what I would like to imagine is opportunities strategically between Canada and U.S. to share a common problem and use critical minerals as a potential pathway to identify incentives and subsidies together. So, we're really close in partnership, and I think that the current government does not represent the feelings of American people towards our neighbors to the north. So I think, there's ways of really thinking through how we can be creative as well, potentially in the future.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions out there or comments? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I don't know if this, yeah, it's on. I work on plastic pollution, and I thank you for one comment on plastics, which is there's not much of a market for it, even though you're able to get it out of the material. But I just actually looked up the Statistics Canada suggests there's about 500,000 tons of plastic waste discarded out of electronics every year in Canada.
Yep.
And I know you're all metals and minerals people, but that's a lot of shit that's going probably nowhere. And it's not circular if we're not talking about it, right? So this, to me, seems like a big gap when we're talking about circularity for batteries and other electronics and recycling. So just wondering if anyone's working on that. I think it's also, somebody mentioned design. I think it was Bryony mentioned design. It's got to be part of a design discussion too. Like, how can we just take the plastic apart, get the stuff out, put it back together? But anyway, no one talked about it, but is anyone thinking and working on this?
I'm guessing, sorry, would you like to, Paul, was there something?
Yeah, I don't want to speak details because, quite frankly, it's not in my area at CSA, but I know CSA has done a lot of work with plastics and recycling, and I'd invite you to even chat with one of my colleagues on this topic, because we've dove deep into that for sure.
Great. You're probably dealing with this on a daily basis?
So I can talk from a battery recycling perspective. So we see all sorts of batteries. There are some that have casings that are not in plastic. It is possible. There are alternatives.
Yes.
Unfortunately, those beautiful batteries that are wonderful to recycle, well designed, are in high-end EVs that I could never afford. And so it's the cost of plastics. It's just, and we've seen that in auto parts throughout the decades where metal parts got converted to plastic parts. So there's a huge issue there. And for a company like ours that was built on environmental values and a strong sense of we will be zero waste, we are struggling with light plastics. They can be revalorized for energy currently, but it's really the only use. So we do partner up with different manufacturers, OEMs, and provide recommendations on design for recycling. And of course, that comes into play. And it's not just the plastic casings, it's also all sorts of materials that are used to isolate the batteries that are problematic. So we have those conversations. Unfortunately, it's the economics of it that make plastics more suitable. And if we want our cars at a certain price range, our EVs will have a lot of plastics in them. But that brings us to probably another societal question, which is why do we need to change cars every 5 years, every 8 years? We have, so Geoff Dunn, who's an important professor in the space, has tested Tesla batteries. And what he's found is if you're not using fast chargers and you're keeping the range within 50% and you're not going below certain levels, your battery can last over 20 years. And he's modeled out a possibility for an EV battery to last forever. Will all EV batteries last forever? Probably not. But if we can come to a space where we don't throw out our car to get the new model, maybe we can have less plastics and better built. I mean, does everyone remember those old fridges, refrigerators that never died?
Never died.
There's something wrong with our products today. They are
planned obsolescence.
So I think that the society has to put in place incentives for us to want to reuse and repair and then that's going to get rid of the plastics problem, I believe.
It helps.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, that really resonates. I think a couple of things in addressing your question. I think it has to do with the market capital available to help this transition. So if one industry is getting $17 trillion a year in subsidies, how can those subsidies be reformatted to investing in this space to actually make products last longer, to get out of this space and reinvent how economy can look like within the planetary boundaries? I think we say the term planetary boundaries, it's relevant. 1.5, 2 degrees, the world is heating up. There's only so much material we can extract. And we have to find a mechanism to really start changing the way we operate as a species. So when you look at reduce, reuse, repurpose behavior around plastic, yes, reuse of plastic, not the continued extraction, single-use throwaway model. We have to adapt, and I think a lot of the work we're trying to do is create the ecosystem for that.
Well, and that also speaks to me, and it's come back to your question around where are the gaps, like where can entrepreneurs fit in? And if we're looking as a primary goal to localize or regionalize these material flows, and what does it take in terms of capacity? Where are the values? Where are the niches within those values? And we have those conversations in a more systematic way that allows different people to come in and take advantage of these waste as resource models. Then I think whether it's plastics or other elements, there's ways that we can start to fill in those niches. I mean, places like Metal Tech Alley in Trail and Rouyn-Noranda and others are these mining hubs that have developed extraordinary, quite diverse sort of talents and sort of micro or small scale businesses that have come in to feed on that niche. And I've got one takeaway, and partly I think all of you kind of referred to, is that if we can have more of those conversations in a much more precise way to talk about the values, impacts, and business priorities, then I think we're well on our way to that critical path to the critical minerals. So I think, and it's right at time. So I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking our guests. And Geoff, thank you very much. We hope this is the beginning of a series, some of which will happen on a more localized basis, some of which binational and beyond, and that this mining and metals and minerals more broadly conversation is integrated on a more regular basis to circularity, so that all of us can have that green energy future that is going to fuel the good work. So thanks again. Have a good night.